A home is not built of wood and brick, but of the soft, small rituals that carve out a fragile pocket of warmth against the vast, indifferent cold. It is the scent of burning birch logs, a heavy, sweet smoke that hangs in the still air above a chimney. It is the gentle rasp of a knife carving a potato, the quiet murmurs shared in the dim, golden light cast by a single lamp. This fragile world, so carefully constructed, can be shattered in a single devastating moment. In the village of Velykyi Bor, a world of such delicate warmth was about to fall to a cold far deeper than the winter outside. The wind was a low moan in the tall pine trees that guarded the village, a constant, mournful sound that had defined Anya Ivanovna Petrova's 30 years of life. She was a woman of the earth, her hands gnarled and powerful from a life spent turning soil and mending nets, but they moved with a surprising tenderness as she braided her son Kolya's dark hair. The fire crackled in the hearth, its heat a welcome weight on her back, its light making the shadows dance on the whitewashed walls. Kolya, 7 years old, sat silently, his large, frightened eyes watching the door, a permanent habit since the first whispers of war had reached their isolated corner of the world. Anya tried to soothe him with a story of a great bear that slept through the winter, safe and warm in its cave. Kolya smiled weakly, but his gaze remained fixed. They both knew a different kind of monster was out there, one that did not fear the cold. The air, thin and sharp, bitted Anya's lungs, each breath a small burn, a small reminder of the world beyond their wooden walls. She ran her thumb along the faint silvery scar above her eyebrow, a memory from a long-ago childhood accident. It was her only imperfection, a tiny hairline crack in the otherwise perfect stoic mask she wore for her son. Then came the sound. It was not the wind, nor the familiar crunch of a villager's boots on the packed snow. This was a ragged, uneven shuffling, followed by the dull thud of something heavy collapsing on the porch. Anya's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She pressed a finger to her lips, silently telling Kolya to hide behind the large wooden chest by the bed. His eyes were wide with terror, but he obeyed without a word, his small body disappearing into the shadows. With a slowness that felt like a lifetime, Anya rose and moved to the door, her hand resting on the smooth, cold wood. She hesitated, a knot of pure dread tightening in her stomach. With a deep breath, she pulled the door inward. Sergei Dmitrievich Volkov lay in a heap on the snow-covered porch, his chest rising and falling in shallow, painful gasps. He was dressed in a tattered Red Army uniform, the wool of his greatcoat matted with a dark, wet stain that was not mud. His face, once proud and strong, was now gaunt and hollow, covered by a wild, unkempt beard. His eyes, though filled with a fevered light, still held the familiar look of her husband, the man who had left as a confident soldier. She knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she touched his cold cheek. He struggled to speak, a dry rattle in his throat. He looked at her with an intensity that burned through the pain, through the fever. He was not the hero she had sent off to war. He was a broken man, defeated not by an enemy army, but by the sheer brutality of it all. He tried to point with a shaking finger, a final, desperate gesture, but his hand fell limp, and his eyes filled with a silent agony, closed for the last time. Anya knelt there for a long time, the cold seeping into her knees through the thin fabric of her dress. The death of her husband was not a surprise. It was a final brutal confirmation of the world's unraveling. A single tear traced a path down her frozen cheek. This was her loss, but it was not the end of her purpose. Her purpose was not to mourn, but to protect. She saw the rifle then, lying half-buried in the snow beside Sergei's motionless body. It was a Mosin Nagant, the same rifle she had seen him clean 100 times. The stock was scratched and worn, but the barrel held a clean, dangerous glint. Her calloused hand, accustomed to the soft earth, wrapped around the cold, hard steel. The metal was frigid, its touch sent a jolt of shock through her skin. Anya carried her husband's body inside and laid him gently by the hearth, the warmth of the fire a cruel irony against his stillness. Kolya, emerging from his hiding place, looked at his mother, his little hands covering his mouth, a silent gasp escaping his lips. Anya did not cry. She simply knelt by the fire, using a thick rag to warm the barrel of the rifle, the metal turning from a dull gray to a dark, menacing sheen. The home, once a sanctuary, was now a fortress. The mother, once a protector of her family, was now a warrior for her village. The brittle silence of the snow outside would soon be broken by a sound that echoed the fire in her heart.
Anya was not a strategist, a soldier, or a hero. She was a mother, and the taiga, the vast, silent forest that surrounded Velykyi Bor, was not a battlefield, but her home. The cold was an old companion, a familiar ache in her bones that she had learned to live with. She had known the taiga since childhood, the way the snow settled on the low-hanging branches of the spruce trees, the brittle snap of a twig underfoot, the hollow echo of a wolf's cry carried on the wind. Now, these familiar elements were no longer just parts of her world, they were her allies. She moved with the quiet grace of a creature of the wild. The cold bit at her exposed skin, a constant stinging reminder that life here was an act of endurance. She wore Sergei's heavy felt boots, which were too big, and a thick homespun wool coat. The Mosin Nagant rifle, its steel barrel and icy weight against her gloved hand, was a foreign presence, an extension of her grief and resolve. The metallic cold of the gun threatened to freeze her fingers to the wood. She remembered Sergei telling her to be careful in the frost, to never touch metal with bare skin. A bitter, ironic memory. The silence of the forest was absolute, a heavy blanket of white. It was a silence that made you listen, made you feel the world around you. And in that silence, she heard them. The crunch of snow was wrong. It was too regular, too methodical, lacking the subtle, unpredictable rhythms of a hunter or a trapper. It was the sound of men marching. She pressed herself against the trunk of a massive pine, the coarse bark a scratchy support for her back. A cloud of vapor billowed from her lips with each shallow breath. Her heart hammered in her chest, a frantic drumbeat of fear and adrenaline. She raised the rifle, the heavy barrel a testament to the weight of her purpose. She was no longer just Anya. She was the sentinel of her home. The first figures emerged from the dense growth of the pines, their gray-green uniforms a stark contrast to the immaculate white of the landscape. They were a reconnaissance patrol, their faces pinched with the cold, their breath visible in the freezing air. They were armed and professional, but their movements lacked the instinctive understanding of the land that Anya possessed. They were arrogant in their power, confident that they were the masters of this alien world. They spoke in a language that was a sharp, aggressive staccato, words that cut the air like a knife. The sound of their footsteps was a symphony of invasion, a desecration of the quiet. Anya steadied her aim, her eyes squinting through the rifle's iron sights. She was not aiming for glory or for a hero's death. She was aiming for time. She had sent Kolya and the other children with the remaining villagers to hide in the deep caves across the frozen river. Her job was to buy them precious minutes, to lead the monster away from them. She took a breath that burned her throat and squeezed the trigger. The shot was a violent explosion, a sound that tore through the silence of the taiga, a shockwave that seemed to make the very trees flinch. The man at the front of the patrol stumbled, a red stain blooming on his chest and soiling the pristine snow. The others scattered, shouting in alarm, their ordered formation dissolving into panicked chaos. They were professional soldiers, but in the face of an unseen enemy, in a brutal, unfamiliar world, they were vulnerable. Anya's hands were shaking, but she forced herself to reload, the bolt sliding back with a sharp, metallic click. The smell of burnt gunpowder hung in the air, an acrid scent that was now the smell of her resistance. She did not wait for them to regroup. Instead, she broke from her cover and ran, her boots crunching on the snow, not toward the caves, but deeper into the forest, away from her family. She heard the return fire, the crack of their Mausers echoing through the trees, a sound that was a constant threat. Bullets splintered the wood of the trees around her, sending fragments of bark and splinters of ice spraying into the air. The taiga, with its endless tangle of trees and its deep drifts of snow, was her maze, her weapon. She dodged behind a fallen log, the roughness of the wood a reassurance against her palm. She heard them shouting to each other, their frustration and fear rising as they chased a ghost in the vast white nothingness. She knew that she had won this small skirmish, but the victory was hollow. The quiet was now gone, replaced by the shouts of the soldiers and the mournful echo of the gunshots. She had broken the brittle silence of the snow, and now it was a sound of conflict. She had forced the hand of the enemy. She was no longer an invisible threat. She was a target. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her more than the cold itself, that the retaliation would be swift and brutal. She had done what she had to do for her son, and now she had to prepare for what came next. The wind howled a new sound through the forest, the sound of a hunt that had just begun. The first sign of the horror was the smell. It was not the familiar scent of wood smoke from a hearth, but a harsh, choking odor of scorched timber and burning resin, carried on the wind like a promise of pain. Anya, having outrun the small patrol and led them deep into the labyrinthine heart of the taiga, turned back. A new dread, colder than the air she breathed, settled in her chest. She had bought them time, a few hours at most, and she had hoped it would be enough. But the enemy was not a soldier who fought for ground. He was an ideology that burned for a new beginning on a scorched earth. The smoke told her that. It was the eagle's retribution. Her feet were heavy in the snow, the felt of Sergei's boots soaked through with melted water and ice. She ran, her lungs burning, not with the effort of the chase, but with a visceral need to know. The smoke grew thicker, a dark, bruised stain against the pale gray sky. Soon she could hear it, the sound of the village dying. The crackle of flames devouring the wooden homes, the sharp snap of structural beams collapsing, the low roar that sounded like a living thing, a beast feeding on what little remained. And then, woven into the terrible symphony of destruction, she heard the screams. Anya burst from the tree line, and the sight that met her eyes was a physical blow. Velykyi Bor was a furnace of despair. Houses she had known since childhood, homes filled with the scent of baked bread and the sound of children's laughter, were now just pyres of flame and dark smoke. The snow, once a pristine blanket of white, was smeared with soot and ash. She saw the figures of the German soldiers moving through the ruins like specters of destruction, their uniforms stark against the fiery backdrop. Anya's grip on the rifle tightened until her knuckles were white. Her mind, a whirlwind of fear and rage, could not process the scope of the loss. Her home, her life, everything was gone, reduced to cinders. For a moment she was paralyzed, a statue of pure grief in the face of absolute desolation. Her breath hitched, a sob threatening to escape, but she forced it down. There was no time for that. Then she saw them. A small group of villagers, a half-dozen men and a few women, moved in a huddled mass, their faces etched with terror. Kolya was with them, his small body a fragile silhouette against the inferno behind them. He held the hand of another child, his eyes wide and scared, but his feet moving forward. He was leading them, just as she had told him. They were heading for the old logging trail that led to the caves, a place of safety. They were her purpose, a flickering hope in a world of darkness. She had to ensure that little spark survived. A cold, clear resolve washed over her, replacing the rage. This was the moment of her choice, the final act of her motherhood. She was not a warrior. She was a diversion. She had to become the monster the Germans were hunting, to lead them away from the innocent, to sacrifice herself so that her son could live. This was the only way she could honor Sergei's memory and the love that had defined her life. The pain of her loss was not a burden, it was fuel. With a deep, burning breath, she moved. She left the cover of the tree line and stepped into the open, a single figure silhouetted against the flames. She raised her rifle and fired 2 quick shots, the sound sharp and defiant, not at the soldiers, but into the air, a bell tolling a challenge. The Germans, initially distracted by the burning village, immediately turned. Their shouts were sharp and decisive. They had found her. She ran, not towards the safety of the caves, but in the opposite direction, toward the deeper, darker woods. She did not look back. She could hear them behind her, the purposeful crunch of their boots on the snow, the shouted commands. She could feel their eyes on her back, a cold, predatory gaze. Her body, already exhausted from the earlier chase, was screaming in protest, but she ignored it. The cold wind bit at her face, her lungs burned with the effort, but the feeling of her blood rushing in her veins was a fierce, determined fire. She was a ghost in the snow, a phantom with a rifle, and they were the hunters. But they did not know this land. They did not understand the language of the taiga. She would use the cold as her weapon, the forest as her shield. The heat of the burning village, a memory of a world now lost, faded behind her, leaving only the biting, relentless cold ahead. She was a sacrifice in motion, a final, desperate act of love.
The cold was no longer a companion. It was a physical weight, a suffocating presence that crushed the very air from Anya's lungs. The world had dissolved into a maelstrom of white. The snow, once a quiet, soft blanket, was now a blinding fury, driven horizontally by a wind that screamed like a banshee through the pines. It was a storm for which the German soldiers were not prepared. A weapon of raw, elemental power that only the land and its people understood. Her body, a machine of bone and muscle pushed far beyond its limits, was a chorus of agony. Her legs burned, her breath was ragged, and the frigid air seared her throat with every gasping inhalation. Her fingers, frozen into claws within her gloves, had long lost all feeling, but they still held fast to the Mosin Nagant, a cold anchor in the chaos. The rifle's metal was so cold it felt hot against her palm. She stumbled forward, a lone, desperate silhouette against the futureless white landscape. Behind her, the sounds of the hunt were muted but persistent. She could no longer hear their individual footsteps, only the distant, muffled shouts carried on the wind, like the cries of gulls lost at sea. They were disoriented, blinded by the very environment they had sought to conquer. Major Klaus Richter, a man of precise maps and methodical plans, was now navigating a world of pure instinct, where the only landmarks were the shadows of trees and the hollow echo of a panicked command. Anya pushed on, her mind a singular, burning focus. The ravine. She had played here as a child, a deep gully carved into the earth by a long-gone river, a hidden wound in the landscape. It was a perfect trap. If she could lead them to it, she could take her stand. She could make sure that her last act was her most important. She felt a new sensation, a cold dread that had nothing to do with the temperature. She was losing her footing, her mind becoming a fuzzy, distant thing. The physical exertion was taking its toll. She slipped on an unseen patch of ice and fell, the rifle clattering on the packed snow. For a moment, she lay there, the wind a thunderous roar in her ears, the snow piling up on her face, the exhaustion a siren song urging her to simply stop. But then she thought of Kolya. She saw his scared eyes, his fragile, small body leading the other children. She felt the warmth of his small hand in hers, and a fierce, primal fire roared to life in her chest. She was not done. Not yet. She rose, grabbing the rifle and scrambling to her feet. She was close. The wind was a solid wall, but she could see the line of the trees breaking ahead, the sudden dip in the horizon that marked the ravine. She could do this. She had to do this. When she reached the edge, she did not hesitate. The fall was short, a controlled slide down the icy slope. She landed softly on a bed of fresh snow at the bottom, the high walls of the ravine a temporary shelter from the wind. She could still hear the hunters above. They were close now, their shouts more distinct. She scrambled behind a thick, snow-laden boulder, a perfect spot for her final stand. The first figure appeared at the top of the ravine's edge, a silhouette of steel helmet and a raised rifle, a specter of the death she was holding off. He was followed by another and another. They fanned out, their faces obscured by the swirling snow. Anya waited, her breath a silent prayer. Then came Major Klaus Richter, a man of discipline and order, and he saw the futility of chasing a phantom. His voice, though distorted by the wind, was a clear command, a demand for his men to be methodical. Anya watched him, a man who saw her not as a human, but as a problem to be solved, a partisan to be eliminated. His cold, calculating eyes scanned the landscape below, his movements betraying no emotion. He raised a hand, a signal to his men. This was it. Anya, with the last reserves of her strength, lifted the rifle. Her fingers, numb and clumsy, fumbled with the bolt. The metal was so cold. She aimed not at the men, but at the ice, holding a massive, precariously balanced pine tree on the opposite slope of the ravine. She knew the snow and the ice. She knew their weaknesses. The storm howled a chilling harmony to her final act. She squeezed the trigger. The shot was a single deafening crack, a thunderclap in the silence of the storm. The sound was swallowed almost instantly by the wind, but it was enough. The bullet struck the ice with a sickening crunch. The tree, already heavy with snow and weakened by the cold, shifted. The sound of splintering wood and groaning roots was terrifying. The tree began to fall. Not in a clean drop, but a slow, agonizing slide down the slope, its branches acting like a scythe. Richter saw it. His eyes, for the first time, widened in shock, not at the falling tree, but at the sheer, desperate cunning of the woman who had done it. He shouted a warning, but it was too late. The massive trunk crashed down, creating a wall of sound and flying snow, a barrier between Anya and the rest of the German patrol. She had bought them time. Her job was done. Her vision was starting to blur. Her legs felt like lead. She turned her head towards the direction of the caves, the direction Kolya and the others had taken. She could see them in her mind, a long, thin line of hope, stumbling through the snow, safe.
She felt a peaceful, deep warmth spread through her chest, a counterpoint to the cold that was claiming her. She was a mother, and she had protected her children. Her final act was a victory. The cold finally took her, and she slipped into the silent embrace of the snow, her mission complete.
A hero's journey does not end when the hero falls. It ends when their purpose is fulfilled, when the torch is passed to those they have saved. The silence that followed the crash of the falling tree was not the silence of defeat, but the heavy, profound quiet of a world holding its breath. Kolya, huddled in the shelter of a thick pine, heard the sound with a child's comprehension. It was his mother's thunderclap, the final, desperate sound of her love, a sound that sealed a door behind them. The group of villagers, exhausted, starving, and numb from the cold, stumbled forward. The wind no longer screamed, only whispered, as if in a reverence. Kolya led them. His small body, once so fragile, moved with a new, quiet authority. His fear was still a dull ache in his chest, but it was eclipsed by the memory of his mother's last words, the silent command in her eyes to keep going, to protect the others. The children, their faces streaked with soot and tears, clung to him, their small hands gripping his coat. The men and women, broken by the sight of their burning homes, followed without question. Their silent sobs were like the sighs of a tired old wind. The journey to the caves was a pilgrimage of endurance. Every step was a battle against the deep snow and the bitter cold, a desperate march to claim the promise Anya had bought them. The only sound was the muffled shuffling of their felt boots and the quiet whimpers of the youngest children. Kolya kept his eyes on the white horizon, his mind a quiet, burning flame of his mother's resolve. He was no longer just running from something, he was running toward a future. They reached the caves just as the first weak light of dawn bled into the sky, painting the snow a soft, bruised purple. The rock face, dark and jagged, offered a promise of sanctuary. One by one, the villagers and children stumbled inside, collapsing in a heap of exhausted bodies, their breaths forming small clouds in the frigid air. Kolya, the last to enter, did not immediately join them. He felt a need to look back, to bear witness. The sky above Velykyi Bor was a thin line of black smoke, a funeral shroud for a village that was no more. But below it, the landscape was silent, still, and untouched. She had done it. Kolya's hand, still numb, brushed against something buried in the snow near the cave entrance. It was a piece of carved wood, a small, simple bird, its wings outstretched as if in flight. He recognized it immediately. It was a toy his mother had made for him from a pine knot one long ago winter, the wood so smooth from her hands that it felt like a part of her. He had dropped it in his panic, and she must have found it, a small talisman of hope, and left it here for him to find. He clutched it. The cold wood now felt warm against his palm. It was her final message. She was gone, but her love, her sacrifice, was a physical thing, a tangible piece of her that he could hold. He looked at the small, frightened faces in the cave. The men and women, the children, they were the remnants of a community, a seed of life that had survived the fire and the cold. He was not a hero of the battlefield. He was a hero of survival. He was the keeper of her legacy. The grief was still there, a hollow space in his heart, but it was not a bitter grief. It was a sorrow filled with a purpose, a profound knowledge that he was alive because she died. Her death was not an end. It was the ultimate act of creation. She had not only protected her children, she had created a new home for them, not of wood and stone, but of sacrifice and memory. Years later, when the war had ended and the snows of winter gave way to the green of spring, the story of Anya Ivanovna Petrova, the last Russian mother, would be told. It would not be a story of a soldier's victory, but a folk tale whispered by hearths and sung by grandmothers to their grandchildren. It was the story of a peasant woman who took up a rifle to protect her village, not for an ideology or a flag, but for the simple, universal love of a mother. Her life was an experience of suffering, but her story, a narrative of pure courage and resilience, became the foundation of a new identity for her community. Her sacrifice was the ultimate victory, a timeless, heartbreaking, and inspiring testament to the power of a single person to create hope where there was only despair. And in a new world, built on the memory of the one that had burned, the small wooden bird would be passed down, a silent, powerful promise that even in the deepest darkness, the flight of hope endures.